We have our last roundtable discussion of today's symposium, and I want to personally thank Gail Nicola for putting it together. I'm very excited to listen to all of the presenters today, and I will let Gail to introduce them all.
Thank you, Marina. And Marina just gave away the fact that she's in Texas with that time zone difference. So my name is Gail Nicola. I'm a member of the HR ASPA Executive Council, and I'm an adjunct professor in the School of Public Service at ODU. And anyone who has taken either of my classes knows that I am a strong believer in a multi-sector approach to problem solving. So today's panel members represent the public, the nonprofit, and the private sectors. And I'm so grateful to these wonderful women for saying yes to me when I sought them out. Our panelists will briefly describe their work, their agency or organization or company's mission. Then they'll discuss how the pandemic has impacted or refocused or informed or redirected their energies, and then conclude with some final thoughts about going forward. And I hope we will have time for your questions as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel members in the order that they will speak to us. And we'll begin with Lynette Diaz. Over the past 12 years, Lynette has served in different roles for both public and nonprofit agencies in California, New Hampshire, and Virginia, with a focus on the fields of child welfare, family well-being, and economic equity. Currently, she serves as the coordinator for the James City County Care Team, which is a grant-funded program centered on well-being education to families who are experiencing complex challenges. Lynette has been a certified Bridges Out of Poverty trainer for 3 years and identifies storytelling and trust building as the foundation for any social movement. Our second presenter is Rhonda Williams. Over the past 20 years, Rhonda has worked in local government, serving children and families affected by trauma and abuse. She currently serves as the program manager for the foster care program in Newport News and is in the MPA program at Old Dominion University, expecting to graduate next year. Our third panelist is Robin Gauthier. Robin is the executive director of Samaritan House, a private nonprofit corporation serving people who have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. During her tenure of 20 years, she has designed and implemented a variety of best practice programs. Most recently, she completed a capital campaign to build a residential home for sex-trafficked minors, which celebrated its groundbreaking in January. Our fourth panelist is Stacy Walls, and I'd just like to mention real quickly that there was a really nice article in yesterday's Virginian Pilot about Stacy and her organization's work in Hampton. Stacy serves as the CEO of the LGBT Life Center. She has been with the center for almost 21 years and has almost 30 years of nonprofit executive leadership experience. The center has served Hampton Roads since 1989, providing HIV services, and in 2011, they opened the region's first LGBT community center. And rounding out our panel from the private sector is Melissa Hazelwood. For the last 9 years, Melissa has served as the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Ferguson, the largest wholesale distributor of residential and commercial plumbing supplies and pipe, valves, and fittings in the United States. She oversees the company's community engagement efforts in 1,600 markets across North America and supports the volunteering efforts of Ferguson's 31,000 associates. So with that brief introduction, Lynette, I'll mute myself and over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So as Dr. Nicola said, my name is Lynette Diaz. I'm currently serving as the care team coordinator for our local Department of Social Services within James City County. Our mission is to really focus on whole family well-being. So that means looking at not just one generation of the household, but all generations within the household. And also looking at what we would consider the traditional health factors like access to health care, health coverage, healthy living, but also the socioeconomic factors, or what we might call the health-related social factors like housing or employment, education, things like this. Our team consists of myself as the coordinator, and we also have an RN, and we have a social worker. And we work as a wraparound around the entire family. One of the interesting things about this work is that it's a little bit of a shift from what has been the traditional model for case management within social services. It's a little bit more proactive and definitely more long-term. We do a lot of work looking at or determining the stress factors that can be mitigated by caregivers or the heads of household through their own behaviors and actions and decisions. But we also are looking at what we know are the systemic stress factors that are complex and wicked and definitely more difficult to really tackle. So we really have learned a lot in the last few years, and partnering with our families instead of doing a top-down service delivery method is the shift that we're hoping to make. The pandemic has really impacted the work that we do. I'm sure many of you have felt the same. Primarily, what I know to be true is that it's lifted the rock that's been covering challenges that families have been experiencing for a very long time. And when I talk about that, I'm not talking about so much the economic resources that, or the economic deficits, but all the other sorts of resources that go into being healthy and well. Some of those could be things like struggles with navigating communication delivery methods, online methods, digital literacy, looking at struggles with a lack of natural, social, or spiritual support within a family, struggles with accessing community resources, and maybe most importantly, the struggles with just feeling unheard and disconnected from the community. And that feeling of connection is a very important resource for a family. I would also say during this time, there's been an awakening to what may be called hidden poverty. And that is really looking at the lack of ability to get out of that paycheck to paycheck mode that many families are in. And, realization, especially in our community, about the amount of children who are living in hotels. And depending on what program or resource you look at, the definition of homelessness changes. So that's definitely something that's becoming more on the forefront of our minds. We've refocused our energy to really make sure that we're working with families around their own schedules, their own goals, and their own abilities and talents. And I am constantly trying to bring in individuals I partner with to the table. So I want to make sure that their voices are heard and that I'm not speaking for them. So that is a strategy that I think has definitely changed during this time. I also think that there's a good amount of self-reflection that's happening within agencies right now. Really looking at ways in which the system may be contributing to some of the barriers, and taking a step back and looking at solutions that are a little different. And so with that, I would say in an ideal world, there's still a lot of work to be done, but primarily I think there's got to be some more education on how social factors are inextricably connected to health and well-being, and recognizing that poverty, or just even being on the brink of poverty, is a public health crisis. And having more systems do more reflection on reactive policies, moving away from reactive policies to doing more proactive initiatives, and really looking at ways that community organizations or nonprofits and even the private sector understand the gaps in resources beyond just food and money. There are also many other ways to be resourced, and primarily transformative relationships, I think, are the ways in which we can start to build a better community. So we hope that with those networks, we are helping those who feel disconnected or isolated. So I remain hopeful, and I know that all the sectors can work together. We just need to make sure that we are bringing those who we are partnering with to the table to hear their voices. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. Rhonda?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna put my glasses on so I can read my notes. As Dr. Nicola said, my name is Rhonda Williams, and I am the program manager for the foster care program for the city of Newport News. The mission of the Department of Human Services is to contribute to the quality of life for the residents in Newport News, and to promote empowerment and independence through human service and community partnerships. And as part of my job, I serve children and families who enter the foster care system. Children can enter the system through Child Protective Services, through the courts, through what we call a CHINS, which is a child in need of services, or for relief of custody petitions. And part of what we do is to try to reunify children with family if at all possible, and try to get them back with their birth parents or some type of family. We also have a push to look toward kin. And we realize that kin does not always have a blood tie, because there are people who are connected to you who are no blood relation, but are just as much family to you as they would be if you were blood. So we definitely try to reach out to fictive kin. And another part of our work is working with our IL population. This is, Virginia has a program called Fostering Futures, which allows youth to remain in foster care past the age of 18. And so we try to work with those young people in order to give them a good, fresh start and be able to enter to adulthood with supports. The pandemic impacted our work in ways that I don't think we anticipate. Well, let me just switch that up. Our work doesn't stop. Anytime you work for a public organization, you know that your work is not going to stop regardless of what's happening in the community. The good part about the preparedness, I would say, that we didn't even know we were being prepared for, was that a lot of things had started to happen prior to the pandemic occurring. So we had foster care on call 24/7 anyway. And we had moved to upgrading some of our IT systems so that everybody had a laptop, and we were ready for that type of work. What we weren't ready for, and what has, I would think, been a benefit, if there's anything to be called a benefit, is our intentional work with staff, intentionally checking in with them and really demonstrating a parallel process. We expect in doing human services and in doing any type of work with the community, we expect that our staff members are going to engage the community in a respectful way, that they are going to be attuned to their needs. And we found, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if your basic needs aren't met, it's hard for you to then turn around and demonstrate what you're not receiving. And so we really had to take a focus and check in on our teams, because everybody was afraid. Everybody was operating at a deficit of not knowing what this pandemic was going to bring. And so we found that we really had to do a lot of checking in with our teams so that they in turn could turn around and check in on their staff, on their team and their clients. So that has continued, and quite frankly, is something that we should have been doing more intentionally before, but it really has become an intentional practice now. And I think that the human capital, the human response, the things that we as organizations have had to do internally for staff have been the long-lasting effect of COVID. We realized that the work did not necessarily have to occur in the building in order for it to be effective. And teleworking has been something that has, quite frankly, it's a draw for people to the field. Finding new staff in this arena has been difficult before COVID. So being able to demonstrate that this work can be done at a still high level in the telework world has really been important, and it has shown staff that we in tune care about them as well. So the check-ins and the focus of intentional support for staff have been definitely impacts of COVID. And also, I mentioned to you the IL youth, the independent living and fostering futures youth. When you have people who already are disconnected from support systems, and Lynette talked a little bit about this as well, you really have to also check in on them, because it was so isolating when you're on lockdown and you already may be disconnected from family. Really checking in with those older youth to say, how are you doing? Nothing to do with work, just how are you? Helps us build relationship. And we have found that building and maintaining relationship has been one of the most important takeaways that we've come away with since COVID. We saw businesses and services shutter as the pandemic raged. We saw therapy offices, because of course, folks weren't going in. So we saw some businesses close, and we saw some partners close. And so connections that our children and families had built kind of severed. But then you saw other innovative things, such as Medicaid expanding telehealth. And so folks were able to receive those type of therapeutic services in the house. However, if your house is not a safe space, then having a therapy service in your house is not necessarily beneficial to you, because you don't have a safe space to have it. So it's like light and shadow that we saw through the pandemic. So the other thing that I think brought to the fore was housing. And I'm sure that this is going to be something that other folks talk about as well, but housing is definitely an issue that the moratoriums are ending and rents have increased. We have people who have spotty rental histories. And so it was difficult for those families to find housing anyway. Now with the increase in housing, the shortage of just available housing, people aren't moving. And so it's difficult for families to find housing, especially young people. I will say that in Newport News, we have had what's called the Fyi Initiative, and that's Fostering Youth Initiative. And this is where we work with our housing authority in order to get a supply of Section 8 vouchers for those young people. And this is pre-pandemic. And so we got, I believe it was 12 to 15 of those vouchers, and we were able to house all of our youth. But even with those vouchers, we found it difficult to find renters who would accept it. That was pre-pandemic. After the pandemic, we have heard that application fees that were once $30 are now $300. So if you have a $300 application fee, you don't even apply for the apartment. And so it leads to even greater disparity for those disenfranchised communities. I think in a perfect world, we would definitely want to see an increase in the housing pool. We would want to be able to show, I think that this pandemic has helped refocus. Those who have a heart for service are truly going into it because they want to serve and they want to help people. But we as the organizations really have to invest in our employees so that they can do the work that they need to do within the community. Housing is an issue, and I think that it's all across the nation. This is not just a Hampton Roads issue. This is a nationwide issue, and we know that this is a wicked problem, as we were talking about before. And so it's going to take community partnership, and it's going to take local agencies coming to the table to talk about how can we, ways that we can kind of leverage that deficit that we acknowledge is there. So I'm so hopeful, and even with all of the negative things that have come about, such as the housing, though we have seen such care and support from the staff, that I am still encouraged.
Rhonda, thank you so much. Robin?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. I am Robin Gauthier, Executive Director of Samaritan House. And Samaritan House has been a resource for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking going on 40 years now. We'll have our 40-year anniversary in 2023. But its foundations were actually serving homeless families in the city of Virginia Beach, because there was no homeless shelter in the city back in the early 80s. And the Department of Social Services asked Samaritan House to get together and build a shelter for homeless families. But as we evolved through the years, we determined that a significant portion of homeless families residing with us were also experiencing domestic violence and fleeing their abusive partners. So we gained the experience and became a domestic violence program as well as a homeless shelter for homeless families. We broadened our work again in 2016 when we were contacted by the Virginia Attorney General's office to work directly with Homeland Security investigations to bring about a human trafficking task force to Hampton Roads. And that task force would require comprehensive victim services and safe housing. So as law enforcement identified human trafficking networks, there would be a safe location to bring the survivors that were identified. So in order to carry out this great mission, we have close to 50 staff and 14 individual shelters in undisclosed locations and a main office in the city of Virginia Beach that is also utilized as an outreach office for anyone to come to us directly. There's no appointments needed, and we don't charge for any of our services. So some of the important things we do is we have a 24-hour hotline for emergency. We have a 24-hour hotline for victims to call or anyone who's in crisis. And we also have emergency housing that can assist up to 75 people in a scattered site model. We have therapeutic services for adults and children, like access to on-site counseling, support group, and victim advocates that assist with people who want to obtain protective orders. And we help accompany them to the police department and also accompany them to court. We also assist victims and people experiencing homelessness with permanent housing location and assist with case management for up to a year when they are rehoused in our Housing Now program. Annually, we serve approximately 250 people in our emergency shelter. Over 400 individuals utilize victim advocacy support, and about 100 families are rapidly rehoused through our Housing Now program. So how has the pandemic impacted us? Well, the pandemic has had a direct impact on domestic violence and human trafficking, and therefore a direct impact on our organization. The stay-at-home orders, while they were intended to help stop the spread of the virus, also exacerbated factors that tend to be associated with domestic violence and human trafficking. So we know that was an unintended consequence. For example, close contact between the victim and the abuser in terms of shared space and time, increased unemployment, stress associated with childcare and homeschooling, increased financial insecurity, poor coping strategies, which lead to increased use of alcohol and other substances. In addition, the orders left parents and children confined to their homes and cut off themselves from friends, neighbors, and colleagues, and bystanders and support systems that were capable of reporting signs of abuse and violence were no longer available to intervene and help potential victims escape their violent situations. And economic independence is a critical factor in violence prevention. For many people who experience violence, the financial entanglement with abusive partners is difficult to sever without an alternative source of economic support. So the pandemic has really exacerbated the financial entanglement by causing increased job loss, unemployment, particularly among women of color and immigrants and workers without college education. And other factors such as courts being closed and having the discretion on which cases were most important to be heard. So many child support cases, child custody cases were not heard in a timely manner, which also had a significant impact on victims, sometimes financially. In terms of human trafficking, predators realized that many children and youth would now be isolated and spending several hours a day online, and they increased their tactics of grooming. That, accompanied with an increase of familial trafficking brought on by the economic impact of the pandemic, was a perfect storm. And studies have even indicated now that about 31% of child sex trafficking cases, the trafficker is a family member, and that trend was rising through the pandemic and continues to rise now. And we also saw individuals who managed to leave their human traffickers, but began considering or were being forced to return back to their traffickers as they had lost jobs, housing, social support due to social distancing and isolation. These impacts on people that use our services and the staff that deliver the services were really overwhelming early on. We were very concerned that the pandemic would actually compromise our ability to fulfill our mission overall. We had concerns about the safety of our staff delivering services. As a crisis agency, we could not shut down, we could not close our doors, we could not work from home. So we had to refocus and focus in directly on our essential services and how we deliver them. And those were the services that saved people's lives. And it was those services that the community had come to depend on Samaritan House for. So right away, we recognized maintaining a 24-hour crisis hotline was the top priority. It's the gateway to all of our services when people contact us from the community. And we needed to protect staff who were going to be here answering the hotline and seeing people coming through our doors, but we couldn't find N95 masks early on. They were not available, and very limited supplies were being diverted to hospitals, rightly so. But staff were very brave in the beginning when little was known about COVID-19 and how to protect ourselves. But we forged on and continued to stay open. Staffing the outreach center so that people could still come to our door and utilize our services was also essential. We designed one room for client intakes. We had new cleaning, social distancing, and mask wearing policies that we had to put in place. We also realized emergency shelter was extremely essential. Law enforcement depend on us when there's a victim in danger. So we had to maintain that service, but it had to be very different now. We had congregate living in each of the 14 shelters. And if we didn't decrease the number of people housed there, we would be a hotspot for spreading COVID-19. And we didn't want to do that. So we decreased the number of people we placed in shelter and used hotels for the overflow, which was very difficult as our demand for emergency shelter was increasing and the number of beds we could offer each safe shelter was decreasing for social distancing measures. Thankfully, we did have some extra funding that came our way because of the pandemic, it compensated us for the majority of the $150,000 we had to spend on hotels in that first year. So now we had to rethink of a strategy on how to conduct necessary programming to meet the needs of our clients and our grant goals and objectives, because none of that changed. Most of the case management was done in-home, meeting our clients where they live. So we had to increase our technology costs for video conferencing like Zoom, getting more Zoom licenses. We did some case management from that platform and still had some case management meetings in the community while we social distance and masked up. We found our clients needed additional financial support to be successful. Grants are amazing, but funds are restricted to specific things. So now our clients might have needed basic items like food or assistance with a utility bill or gas. And our current grant funding was not, that source may not have been eligible to assist with that item. So it became sort of a challenge for us to meet those new needs based on the pandemic. We were not using our general volunteers due to increased exposure. Many of our volunteers were seasoned or older volunteers. And so many of those activities that volunteers assisted with fell on staff. And they were already overworked, concerned about the impact of the pandemic on themselves and their own family. Like Rhonda, we had to be trauma informed with our staff. Often we focus on our clients' needs, forget about how hard the pandemic was on our staff. So we had more lunches. The board gave out gift cards occasionally with staff appreciation cards. We had to be more flexible with staff schedules because many of them are moms who were homeschooling. We had extra pay and we had stay-on bonuses, anything to really reward and thank the staff for being out there in the early days of the pandemic when we were so scared, not knowing how everything was transmitted. The pandemic did affect our revenue. We could no longer host our major fundraisers like our gala and our big luncheon we have every year. And our development department had to revise our fundraising events that were not reliant on people gathering together, which is really difficult. But we did move to a televised event that brought in similar amounts of revenue. So we survived that very first year. And now we're doing that televised event every year because it brought in a good amount of funding. And so this will be our third year doing a televised event. But most importantly, we kept a close eye on what the CDC, Department of Health, Department of Labor required of us. We watched as the new executive orders came out from the governor and what we had to do to maintain in compliance, and so that we could be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So in an ideal world, we would like to never have another pandemic, and we would like to return to the way work life was pre-pandemic. But in all of it, we found that we were very resilient. We never closed our doors. We were able to retool our services. We continue to deliver some of our services remotely and safely. And we learned that a strong board of directors, ones that can approve new policies and procedures very quickly, is extremely essential. And strong managers and leaders in the agency and key staff that remain steadfast on fulfilling our mission has made all the difference in the world. Thank you.
Robin, thank you so much. Stacie?
Hi, everyone. I know we're behind, so I'm going to try to go a little bit fast. I have a lot of the same experiences Robin and Rhonda referenced, some of the same vulnerable communities that show up at our organizations. And so a lot of it is very, very applicable. The LGBT Center provides, we're a regional provider, so we serve all cities in Hampton Roads from Williamsburg all the way up through the northern neck and 3 rivers of the peninsula down through the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So we have a very large service area. We provide services to the LGBTQ community and people living with HIV. We have been serving this community since 1989. And I think one of the things that came up for us was that our organization actually was born out of a epidemic. We were born out of the HIV epidemic that happened in the 80s. And so, you know, for us, that is something that we're like, we could do this. We were born out of a crisis, we can do this, but never really did I think that that would mean that within a 2-week time period, I needed to get every single employee laptops and get them out of the office and home. And so those are things that we just hadn't prepared for, but accomplished. And so there was a lot of proud moments where we're like, oh my God, I can't believe we just did that. And yet we did. And so, but one of the things that we repeatedly said to our staff is, look, you may not have been around during that time period, but when HIV was at its peak, this is when we started. And so we are going to take some of those principles of operating during an emergency, a pandemic, an epidemic, and translate them to today. When I was first approached about this particular speech or this particular panel, it was a particularly challenging day when Gail sent the email, and I probably unloaded way more than I should have about pulling together opinions about this topic. And so I actually went back and looked at that email that I sent Gail, and I remember telling her, like, I reached my 20-year anniversary last year at the organization, and the last 2 years have actually felt like 10 years. It's been exhausting, and I don't believe that most funders and donors and even our staff realize the toll that it has taken on nonprofit leaders. Certainly they feel it amongst themselves and the staff, but the leadership in the nonprofit sector, I have seen so many long-term leaders leave their positions. And it's unfortunate because the nonprofit sector struggles with leadership opportunities and a deep bench for it, and it's really unfortunate. And so I think COVID wreaked havoc on our staff, causing ongoing burnout and frustration. Much of that frustration is burnout that is contributed to external resources that we don't really have an impact on, like people that were home with their kids, or grieving loss of family members who died of COVID, or grieving jobs that were lost in the household. Inflation is something we're still dealing with our staff, but these are all things that are life experiences that certainly carry over to the work environment and contributes to the burnout and the challenges that a lot of our staff are experiencing right now. Also, public health serving organizations like us and a lot of the people working with homeless individuals, you know, that the nonprofit service organizations serving already vulnerable communities and individuals are experiencing a leadership crisis anyway, but it seems that so many have left the sector, and those that are left behind, we use this, and it's not a great example, but it is just kind of like this Walking Dead mentality of we're just exhausted. You see this depiction of zombies that are just kind of going through the motion. And there are days that are like that. You know, we are exhausted and trying to figure out how to get by without having returned to normal operating procedures, while also managing funder expectations that we should be returning to some pre-pandemic norms. So there was a lot of grace that was given during particularly the first year of the pandemic, in that, look, we don't want staff to do unnecessary things, and there were waivers and things like that. But a lot of that is going away, and yet people are burnt. People are really, really burnt. And so dealing with that is sometimes more than just a check-in. And so as a leader, the other thing that I really struggled with is our fundraising, particularly event-related fundraising, has not fully returned. And yet, you know, COVID relief funding has stopped. And so, you know, nonprofits who are nonprofits are not exempt from this great resignation that is happening out in the world. And so, but many don't, a lot of nonprofits, and I'll speak for myself, we don't necessarily have a really deep bench or the resources to address the shortages and the turnover without negatively impacting the staff who have stayed with us and are burned out and overwhelmed. And so supporting our communities and the people that we serve has to start with supporting the organizations doing that work, and specifically supporting our leaders and our staff. I also want to say it's not all bad news. Like, there's been some really good things that came as well. And, during COVID, we started and expanded some programs and found different strategies to support our clients. And telehealth is one of those. We have a clinical counseling mental health program, and we were not doing telehealth pre-COVID. But when we started telehealth, we got a huge influx of new clients, which was also new revenue. And then we were like, we could actually do this through the whole state. Like, our therapists are certified in Virginia, not just Hampton Roads, but Virginia. And LGBTQ affirming therapists, there's a shortage. So it's like, all right, let's start to advertise this in other parts of the state. And that's been really effective. Additionally, we have a lot of people living that are aging with HIV. And so we were worried about our seniors. And we didn't have a formal seniors program at the time, but we transitioned some of our existing staff who couldn't do their jobs, like our outreach staff and our testing staff. We repurposed them to, calling and checking in on the seniors and just saying, hey, can we bring some food and leave it on your porch? Can we bring you anything? And so that shift of, and I hate the word pivot because it's overused, but that shift of repurposing staff to other duties kept them busy, kept them doing new things, and gave us new strategies. We expanded our hours in our service centers. Yeah.
It's Gail. Can I interrupt you just for a second, because Melissa has a 1 o'clock commitment. Can you stop just for a second right there? Let Melissa weigh in, and then we'll get back to you. Dr. St-Galena has given us permission to go a little bit longer, so I'll come right back to you. Okay, thank you. Melissa, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'll be very quick with you all today. I apologize. I do have another meeting, another presentation at 1 o'clock. But I oversee, as Dr. N shared, our Ferguson Cares program. And it really is an integral part of the company's overall environmental social governance, ESG strategy, if you will. ESG is a really investor-driven term, and the concept of bucketing all of the things that your company is doing in those spaces. But the concept of giving back to the community isn't new at Ferguson. It's something that we've done, since we started here almost 70 years ago. And our company is committed to strengthening our communities across, North America, with a focus on housing, clean water and proper sanitation, and the skilled trades. The focus today is on housing, so we'll just focus there. But one of the big things and that we saw come out of COVID, there was a lot of changes, and without a doubt, it's forever changed the way we operate as a business and how we see the world. But one of the interesting things that came out of it, and you can look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, is that business is now the most trusted institution ahead of NGOs, government, and the media. But employees trust their employers at 77% that their employees are at the top. Employers at the top of the list, and businesses are expected to speak out, engage in controversial issues, social issues, and policy. People want more business engagement, not less, and some will even go as far to say business isn't doing enough. Ferguson is very engaged in the housing space, and we will continue to do more so to ensure everyone has a decent place to live, access to shelter, and affordable housing. We have significant national partnerships with Homes for Our Troops and Rebuilding Together. And locally here, we partner with Habitat for Humanity for Kids, Virginia Supportive Housing, the Housing Development Corporation, and HELP. Our first foray really into collaborations in the public-private sector was the Homeless Hotline. So we funded that through the Peninsula Community Foundation. I think that was about 6 or 7 years ago, to provide that service that anyone in the area could call and try to find a bed. And it was the back end, the HRMS system. We want to use our products and our resources and our people and our volunteers and our expertise to really collaborate and try to address these issues. And I think, if we looked at a perfect world and what we could do, it would be to take the burden off of the nonprofits and the community partners addressing this issue. It's not all on them, and provide the right resources. Stacy touched on it with some of the funding, right? Like a lot of corporate funders are asking for metrics and they want to demonstrate impact, but they're not willing to fund those initiatives, right? So how can we engage in more trust philanthropy and say, Stacy, we know you're doing what you're doing and go for it. Tell us where you need support. So really, engaging in some interagency things. How can we work with municipalities to provide more affordable housing or develop more shelters? Robin touched on that there wasn't a shelter for domestic violence in Virginia Beach, certainly a while ago, but the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard, is very prevalent. And I think it deters a lot of housing. So, we've done some really good work and there's definitely more to be done, but we'll focus on finding the right partners and giving them the right resources to do what they do best. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope it was helpful.
Melissa, real quickly, how can any of our partners engage with Ferguson?
2 ways. You can send an email to fergusoncares@ferguson.com, or you can go to ferguson.com and click on the Ferguson Cares link. Some of the information has to be updated, but there is a link to our grant funding application, and you can fill that out and we'll get it and review it. And we just had a meeting today, but we meet quarterly. So our committee reviews all of the grant requests and determines funding. But there's a lot to be said out there, and we would love to find the partners that can help us address these issues in our community.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being able to join us today. I know you have another engagement.
Thank you.
So appreciated. Stacy, I'm gonna go back to you at this point, and I apologize again for cutting you off.
No problem. I'm happy to accommodate Melissa, and don't worry, I will be asking her for money just to help make that happen. So, but yeah, I mean, we actually had opened up a conversation after our initial meeting, because it is just the philosophy of that trust philanthropy and all of those things. And I think that's kind of in the ideal world situation that I was going to talk about, is that sometimes corporations just do not understand the flexibility that is needed with really great intention, right? There's really great intention for corporations to support nonprofits, but when a funding opportunity comes along and the caveats are, well, we won't fund staff, and we won't fund general operating, and we won't fund marketing, and we won't fund all these things, like how is it expected that some of these, that we can't provide a new service every single time a funding opportunity comes along? And so, that for us, and specifically in the ideal world to talk about those things, is that we would hope that the nonprofit sector is understood, and that there should be funding with priority to ensure that our vulnerable communities are served. Corporations and foundations and those opportunities for funding would hopefully fund without restrictions. And that doesn't mean there's no accountability. It means that please don't ask us for stuff that creates a lot more work. If a group of volunteers are willing to volunteer and there's 20 of them, then I've got to do quite a bit of work to accommodate a group of 20 volunteers. And so just keeping that in mind, I think there are some really great opportunities for partnership, but it takes some understanding of what this nonprofit sector really needs. And in an ideal world, funders would recognize that general operating costs in a nonprofit are exactly the same as doing business in a for-profit entity. We still pay our utilities, we still have facility costs, we still have benefits for our staff, we still have retention strategies for our staff, and these are general operating or overhead expenses that are necessary. And so I think for me, in an ideal world, there would be acknowledgement that operating a business is the same regardless of if it's a nonprofit entity or a for-profit, and recognize that when we do make a profit, even a small one, that is money that's reinvested in the services that we provide. I think that donated goods and in-kind services are incredibly helpful for a lot of things. It just doesn't allow us to operate a program, the entire program. So cash is needed as well. And when a corporation or a grant funder requires additional reporting requirements, limitations on those donations are painful, and it creates a burden. And so I think that first year of COVID, where, you know, we had, like, for example, we had a corporation call us up and say, oh, we'd like to have a call with you to see if you could use some additional funds during this time period. And we're like, great, this is going to be like, you know, we did all our preparation. We're fully expecting about a $2,500 donation. And this corporation came through with a $25,000 corporation and then funded us the next year at the same level. And that is what those are the types of partnerships that we need. And yet we were wrong. Like, we were like, oh, this is just going to be another one of those. We're going to do all this work and it's not going to pay off. But it did. And it paid off with no reporting requirements, et cetera. And so I think taking those opportunities that came out of COVID and helping and building them out for continued partnership is something that we all should do. And I think there's only one last thing I'd like to highlight is, for example, one of the challenges that we had during COVID is that our pantry is produced by local churches. We have 17 local churches that cook for our pantry. They put all the meals in program and individual servings, we freeze them, and we have staff that take them out to clients. When COVID started, these churches couldn't gather to cook. And we lost about 15,000 meals that are delivered on a regular basis. And so we had a funder that showed up and said, what do you need? I'm like, we can't do our food pantry. And so they gave us funds. We partnered with 2 local restaurants who also were struggling because they couldn't operate. And so we paid them to produce meals for us that we could then give to our clients. So that type of partnership, had the foundation not been willing to look at a creative way to do it, we supported local businesses. They stayed in business because they made thousands of dollars during this time and did something good for the community. And so, you know, it was a unique way to do it, and it was quick, and yet we learned. We now have partnerships with those restaurants long-term. They believe in the mission. And so those are the things that will stay post-COVID. And there's good things, but there's bad things. And the staffing and the burnout and the frustrations of expectations and not recognize, and a lot of what Rhonda said resonated with me, checking in with staff and supporting staff, but that's not free either. And so, you know, I've spent the last couple of weeks reapplying for grants that Robin and I have similarly. And I'm just tired of doing work that is below, or that we're not reimbursed for what we actually cost to do that work. And so having that dialogue with funders and with corporations and local governments, like, we can't do this work for free anymore. It just burns out our teams. And then it creates turnover, and then it creates unfulfilled missions. And so that's been my mantra for quite a while, but I've said it a lot more since COVID started than I did even before. And so those are in a perfect world, that's not an argument that we would have to make. And so that's kind of all that I had. So if you have any questions, that'd be great.
Stacie, thank you so much. And everybody, Lynette, Rhonda, Robin, and Melissa, who had to leave us. Thank you so much for telling us the hard truths and the joys and the, you know, the wonderful rewards that you bring to our communities. I think that Dr. St-Gallen will give us maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Are there any questions for anybody? Please go ahead and unmute if you have a question and just ask.
Hi, this is Robin for Robin. I'm curious to know what you think is the future for educating youth about human trafficking. If you're seeing that in schools or not, I hear about it so much, but I don't know if our young people are being educated about it.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're able to do is I have a full-time prevention specialist, and she's able to go into schools. She's able to work with Girl Scout troops. She's able to work with churches and anyone else who will hear us talk about it. And so there's lots of federal programming coming out that can probably work with the school system and do something that would be a permanent training in the schools. But right now, that's just not happening. And so we're doing everything we can to speak to anyone who is letting us speak. And that's at least a full-time job. And we have a prevention specialist, and that's all she does. And so the schools have let us do some programming, and also the Boys and Girls Club. We have been working with the Boys and Girls Club for many, many years doing prevention work. And so social media is probably going to be the best way to get to youth on prevention. But it is very, very tricky. These traffickers are grooming people online, telling them that they're going to be your boyfriend, your girlfriend, telling them you're going to go to modeling school, I'm going to pick you up and take you somewhere, or just dating them and then down the road, making them work. And so they're very, very tricky and very slick. And it's a difficult issue to manage.
Any other questions for anybody on our panel?
I have kind of a broad question for all of the panelists. I mean, given all of the shifts and changes that you all went through in the last 2 years, what would be one thing that you would actually keep, and like kind of like that silver lining that some of you talked about? Like, what's one thing that you would like to stay coming out of this pandemic?
I'll just start with saying some of the outreaches that we've done using technology has increased participation. And so we are definitely keeping those things in place.
I would also say flexibility for staff, as Rhonda talked about as well. I think, oftentimes our staff are just burnt out, and this was another layer of it. So having that flexibility for teleworking or, just flexible schedules, I think is crucial.
For us, finding ways to fundraise that don't include face-to-face meetings or events or things like that, that was probably the most helpful. And many of those things that we've done are going to stay.
Yeah, I think it's the same. And I think that the flexible funding, and I don't say that without accountability. I'm saying the ability to spend the funds where we need to in order to get the job done and still produce outcomes, because I'm not trying to get out of that. I am trying to say, look, we know where we need to spend the money and where we have other funds that can complement it. And so that flexible funding, whether it's from a government grant, a state grant, a foundation grant, or just a private funder, like, we know what we need to do. And so, one of the things that I thought was great, we had a tech firm reach out to us and asked if we needed something. Look, we needed tablets so that we could drop them off at our client's house so they could have their telehealth mental health appointment. Like, that works. My case manager sat in the car while the client had their, flexibility in how we can accomplish our services is what I thought was the best part and continued need for post-COVID.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. I so appreciate your work, and the communities that you serve do as well.
Gail, I just saw Gary unmute himself, so I just wanted to make sure if you had a question, we could take one more question.
Gary, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I just want to say all the panels were outstanding, and I think it just reinforced the themes that we need more collaboration between all of the governmental sectors with business and nonprofit. We can't solve this alone. And another thing that it interfaced is that I think both sectors, government and nonprofit, are facing this this crush in terms of people leaving and increased workload. So I think it's going to be a combination of new innovative in terms of innovations, in terms of technology, but you're still going to have a lot of human solutions because a lot of government positions are still high touch and high emotional investment. And there's no way to substitute human contact. So it's a common challenge. And I just hope too that the federal government invests more, because one of the things I'm very disappointed is that the budget that's going forward in Congress has no funding for COVID related activities. They pretty much have just cut it out. So we're still behind the 8 ball when it comes to the solutions for the future.
Thank you, Gary. Gail, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just kind of close out and actually build off of Gary's comment. Just a reminder to everybody that our next April event is one that focuses on kind of that future trajectory of public service and kind of the public service landscape. And it's particularly oriented to students. So students, we would love to see you. Faculty, please encourage your students to participate. I had originally hoped to conduct a poll, but my poll doesn't seem to be working. It says I'm logged on to a different computer. But keep an eye out because we are planning our May award celebration and trying to decide whether we want to try and pull together an in-person award luncheon or if that might be something we would keep for the next year when Marina transitions to becoming our chapter president. So to just kind of wrap up, I would like to thank our panelists, our presenters, the moderators, the organizing committee. Thank you so much for all of your contributions to our chapter and to the public service field and the profession here in Hampton Roads. I hope the audience has appreciated the insights and the feedback and everything that we've heard today. Take some of this to heart and thinking about kind of how we move forward to hopefully also a life, you know, beyond COVID, where it's not going to be back to normal, but maybe a better normal. So thank you all. I hope to see you at our future events and have a great day.
Thank you all.